The drought came slow and stayed long. By July the fields cracked open like old pottery, zigzag lines running through the tobacco rows like lightning frozen in clay. The well rope came up lighter each morning, and by afternoon the dipper hung empty over the trough, swinging on its nail with nothing to give. In the quarters, folks passed 1 tin cup among 6 mouths and nobody complained aloud. Complaints drew attention, and attention drew the overseer's boot, or worse. The plantation sat at the edge of 3 counties, where the land turned from rich bottomland to sandy pine barrens in the space of a mile. The tobacco fields stretched south toward the river, their leaves yellowing early from lack of water. The cotton fields ran east, their bowls opening small and sparse. Between them lay the quarters, a double row of cabins with mud-chinked walls and roofs that leak when it rained, which it hadn't done in 7 weeks. The owner's house stood on the highest ground, a 2-story structure with white columns and a wraparound porch that caught whatever breeze managed to stir. But even there, the heat pressed down like a physical weight. The cisterns were half empty. The ornamental garden had gone brown. The magnolia tree by the front steps dropped its leaves early, littering the ground with waxy brown circles that crunched underfoot. The child no more than 9 summers old, maybe 10 if you counted winters, instead sat on the step outside the cookhouse with her baby brother balanced on her hip. His name didn't matter to anyone but her. His lips were chapped white at the corners, cracked deep enough to bleed when he cried. She wet her thumb on her own tongue and rubbed it across his mouth, slow and careful, then hummed low and steady. The same for notes her grandmother used to hum when the bread dough wouldn't rise, when the rain wouldn't come, when the night felt too heavy to carry alone. The baby quieted, his breathing slowed and matched the rhythm of her sound. The child's grandmother had been a woman of quiet power, the kind who knew when a storm was coming by the way the chickens huddled, who could find water by watching where the morning dew lasted longest, who sang hymns that seemed to hold more than just melody. She died 3 winters back, when the influenza swept through the quarters and took the old and the very young without mercy. Before she died, she'd pressed a ribbon into the child's hand, a scrap of faded blue cloth, soft from years of wear, and whispered words the child didn't fully understand then but carried with her like a promise. When the songs need singing, you'll know the notes. When the path needs finding, you'll see the way. The child wore that ribbon around her wrist now, tied tight enough not to slip but loose enough not to cut. She touched it sometimes when she hummed, her fingers tracing the frayed edges, remembering. Across the yard, dust devils spun themselves into small funnels and died against the barn wall. The air tasted like iron and smoke. The heat made everything shimmer and waver, like the world was melting at the edges. Dogs lay panting in whatever shade they could find, too hot to bark or chase the chickens that scratched listlessly in the dirt. Even the flies seemed sluggish, their buzzing slower than usual. The stable hand worked in the barn, mucking stalls that were cleaner than they needed to be because there was nothing else to do, and idle hands drew the overseer's attention. He was a man in his 30s, tall and lean with shoulders that had carried heavy loads since boyhood. His real name was Samuel, though most folks called him Sam when the overseer wasn't listening. He'd been born on this plantation, same as his father before him, and knew every inch of the land where the soil ran rich, where the gullies washed out in heavy rain, where the old boundary stones marked property lines that had shifted over the years as debts were paid and land was sold. Sam had tried to run once, years ago, when he was barely 20. Made it as far as the river before the dogs caught him. The scars on his back told that story better than words ever could. But he'd learned things on that journey, learned the land beyond the plantation borders, learned which roads the patrols traveled and when, learned the names of people who helped and people who didn't. He'd tucked that knowledge away like coins in a jar, waiting for a day when it might be worth something. The cookhouse woman, Letty, worked over a fire that made the already oppressive heat nearly unbearable. She was making corn mush with the last of the meal, stretching it thin with water and salt because there was nothing else to stretch it with. Her face ran with sweat, her headscarf soaked through, but she kept stirring, kept working, because the hands would need something in their bellies before they went back to the fields. Letty had been brought to the plantation 15 years ago, sold away from her family in Virginia, when the owner needed cash to pay gambling debts. She'd left behind 3 children, all of them too young to remember her now. The grief of that loss had carved lines in her face that made her look older than her 40-some years. But she had a gift for making something from nothing, could turn scraps into meals, could find herbs in the woods that eased pain or brought down fever, could sing songs that lifted spirits even when there was no logical reason for spirits to lift. The child watched Letty work, watched the way her hands moved with practiced efficiency, the way she tasted the mush and added a pinch more salt, the way she hummed under her breath a different melody, and the child's four-note hymn, but somehow complementary, like two parts of the same song. The owner stumbled coming down from the big house just after noon, his boots scraping the gravel twice before his knees folded under him. He went down hard in the dust, one arm flung out like he was reaching for something that wasn't there, a rail, a hand, a promise. His hat rolled 3 feet and stopped against a stone. Master Charles Whitfield was a man in his 50s, though the drink and the sun had aged him beyond his years. He'd inherited the plantation from his father 20 years back, along with a mountain of debt and a property that was slowly dying from mismanagement and bad luck. He wasn't the worst of his kind, didn't use the whip as freely as some, didn't break up families for sport, didn't take liberties in the quarters the way other masters did. But he was weak in the ways that mattered, weak with money, weak with drink, weak with the men he trusted to run his affairs. His wife had been the strong one, the one who'd kept the books and managed the household and made sure the hands were fed even in lean times. But she died 5 years back, taken by the same fever that swept through periodically, respecting neither wealth nor station. After her death, the plantation had begun its slow slide toward ruin. Fields went unplanted, debts went unpaid, the overseer gained power that should never have been his. Now the owner lay in the dust, his face flushed red and slick with sweat, his breathing labored and strange. The fever had come on fast, started that morning as a headache and a chill, progressed to trembling and confusion by midday. His eyes rolled back, showing mostly whites, and his hands twitched like he was trying to grab hold of something invisible. The overseer came running from the barn, shouting orders that made no sense and contradicted each other within the same breath. Fetch water. No. Fetch the doctor. No. Fetch rags and move faster. You lazy-handed devils, this fever's on you, all of you, for letting the work slip and the prayers go soft. He pointed at the stable hand, at the cookhouse girl, at the child herself, his finger jabbing the air like a blade. Lazy hands brought this fever, he said, loud enough for the whole yard to hear, loud enough for the field hands to stop mid-step and turn. And now the patrollers are coming for what's owed. Josiah Crow, the overseer, was a man who'd clawed his way up from nothing and wore his small power like a crown. He'd come to the plantation 7 years ago, hired after the previous overseer died of a stroke. He'd promised efficiency, promised order, promised to turn the failing operation around. And he had, after a fashion, but his methods were brutal, his cruelty calculated, and his ambitions extended far beyond simply managing field hands. Crow had been skimming for years, taking money meant for supplies and pocketing it, selling portions of the harvest on the side and keeping the proceeds, falsifying records to make it look like the plantation was deeper in debt than it actually was, then using that manufactured debt as leverage. He'd been building his own nest egg, planning for the day when the owner would finally collapse under the weight of everything and the property would go to auction. Crow aimed to be the beer, or to positioned himself so that whoever did buy would need him to run things. But the owner's sudden illness complicated his timeline. If the owner died now, before certain arrangements were made, before certain documents were signed, Crow's carefully constructed house of cards might collapse. And there were other complications: old papers he thought he buried, old promises that might surface, old debts that weren't his to collect, but which he'd been collecting anyway. So when he heard the dogs baying in the distance, heard the patrollers coming to collect on debts both real and manufactured, his mind raced through calculations and contingencies. He needed the owner alive long enough to sign what needed signing. And he needed certain people silenced, particularly anyone who might know about the papers hidden in the chapel, about the manumission clauses his predecessor had honored but which Crow had buried, about the families he'd split and sold when he had no legal right to do so. The child heard the dogs first, distant and thin, baying on the far side of the tobacco fields where the property line met the county road. The sound carried on the dry wine, each park sharp and separate like stones dropped into a tin pail. She pulled her brother closer, tucked his head under her chin, and began the hymn again for notes, low and even. No rush, no waver, no decoration. Just the bones of the melody. Around her, the other hands stopped moving and started breathing in time with the sound. The mule in the barn let out one long sigh. The chickens stopped pecking. Even the dust seemed to settle. There was something in those for notes that reached deeper than hearing. It wasn't magic, not the way Crow would later claim, trying to twist it into witchcraft to discredit what couldn't be denied. It was older than that, simpler. It was the kind of sound that mothers made to soothe babies, that sailors sang to steady their rowing, that field hands used to pace their work and make the hours pass. It was rhythm and breath and the human need for something steady in an unsteady world. That the child's grandmother had taught her something more, had taught her that certain melodies carried information, that patterns could be stitched into sound the same way they were stitched into quilts, that a song could be a mat if you knew how to read it. The four-note hymn was the foundation, the anchor, the thing you returned to when you needed grounding. That there were other verses, other variations, other meanings layered underneath. The child didn't fully understand all of it yet. She was too young, had too little experience. But she carried the music in her bones, and when the time came to use it, her body knew what her mind hadn't yet learned. By nightfall the lanterns were ordered lit, every last one, even the cracked glass lamp that smoked when the wick burned uneven. The overseer stood in the center of the yard with his hat in his hands, twisting the brim until the straw started to fray. His face was slick with sweat despite the coolness settling in. "Only place left to gamble for water," he said. His voice hoarse and strange, "is the swamp." Nobody spoke. The swamp meant sinkholes and cottonmouths and channels that shifted every season. It meant fever ground and patroller routes and places a body could disappear without a trace. The swamp was where runaways went when they were desperate, where bodies turned up months later, if they turned up at all, where even the patrol dog sometimes refused to go because their instincts told them the ground couldn't be trusted. That the owner was burning up, his skin hot enough to blister, and the well was down to damp stones at the bottom. The doctor had been sent for hours ago, but hadn't arrived, probably couldn't be bothered to come out for a patient who owed him money, or maybe the roads were being watched and he didn't want to risk the journey after curfew. Either way, they were on their own, so they prepared to go. Letty packed what little food there was: some cornbread, a piece of salt pork no bigger than your palm, a sack of parched corn. Sam readied the mule, checking its feet and rubbing sag into the cracks in its hooves, speaking to it in a low voice, preparing it for hard travel. The boatman, a free black man named Moses, who worked the river and knew the swamp better than most, was summoned from his cabin near the landing. He came reluctantly, knowing what such a journey meant, but he came. The midwife appeared as they were preparing to leave. Her name was Dinah, and she was one of the few people on the plantation who could move relatively freely, her skills valuable enough that even Crow thought twice before crossing her. She was a woman in her 60s, small and wiry, with hands that were always busy stitching, mixing, measuring, preparing. She knew herbs and poultices, knew which roots stopped bleeding and which leaves brought down fever, knew prayers and songs that were older than any church. She also knew secrets, knew which babies weren't the husbands, knew which deaths hadn't been entirely natural, knew which documents were hidden where and why. The overseer feared her, though he'd never admit it. There were things she could say that would unravel his carefully constructed lies, and she'd made it clear over the years that her silence had a price: not money, but restraint. Don't push too hard, don't break apart families without cause, don't sell the children until they're old enough to survive it. It was a devil's bargain, but it saved lads, and she'd made her peace with it. Now she packed her bag with herbs and tools, told Letty what to do if anyone went into labor while she was gone, and joined the expedition without asking permission. Crow started to object, but one look from Dinah shut his mouth. He needed the owner alive, and if that meant letting the midwife come along, so be it. They left after curfew, when the patrolled bells had rung twice, and the roads were supposed to be empty of anyone without a pass. The owner was carried on a litter made from poles and the Sunday quilt, the good quilt, the one with the careful stitching and the border that Letty had worked on for 2 years. His face was slick with fever sweat, his eyes rolled back white so only the edges of his pupils showed. Every few minutes he'd mutter something, words that didn't connect, names of people long dead, snatches of prayers, or songs, or arguments with ghosts. The overseer walked ahead with a lantern, the flame jumping and settling with each step. He carried a pistol in his belt and a knife in his boot, and his eyes darted constantly, watching the shadows, listening for sounds that didn't belong. The stable hand led the mule, a gray beast with scars on its withers and a patient, tired soul. The animal had been worked hard for 20 years and still showed up every morning ready to pull whatever needed pulling. Moses walked beside the child and told her in a low voice to watch for cypress knees that could snap an ankle, for mud that looked solid until you stepped and then swallowed you to the waist. The child touched the mule's cheek, just a brush of her palm against the coarse hair above its eye. The animal swung its head toward her hand and followed her into the fog like it trusted her more than the rope. Sam noticed the way the mule's entire bearing changed when the child touched it, noticed how an animal that had been balky and stubborn all day suddenly walked steady and sure. He filed that observation away, another piece of information that might matter later. The last house light disappeared behind them within the first quarter mile. The patrol roads ran east and west, flat and wide, and watched. They walked south, where the ground turned soft and the air smelled like rotted leaves and standing water. Moses warned them twice about the cypress knees, about the snags that hid just under the waterline, about the stories he'd heard of men walking into the swamp and never walking out. The overseer didn't slow. He kept the lantern high and the pace fast, muttering about debts and doctors and how long a man could live without clean water. His voice was tight and high, like a wire pulled to taut. The swamp at night was a different world. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a presence, thick and tangible, pressing in from all sides. The fog rolled through the cypress trees in waves, sometimes thick enough to choke on, sometimes thinning just enough to see shadows that might have been trees or might have been something else. The water reflected what little light there was, turning the ground into a mirror that showed nothing clearly. Sounds carried strange in the swamp. A frog croaking 50 yards away might sound like it was right beside your ear. A branch cracking might echo 3 times before fading. And then there were the silences, sudden and complete, like the swamp was holding its breath, waiting for something. Those silences were the most frightening of all, because they meant something large was moving, something that made even the insects go quiet. The child hummed the whole way, the same for notes, over and over, a loop that never ended and never varied. The rhythm kept their feet steady even when the fog swallowed the path and the ground turned to soup. The stable hand found himself stepping in time with her sound. The mule's hooves fell on the same beat. Even the overseer's muttering quieted after a while, his breath sensing to the melody without him knowing it. Moses noticed it too. He was a man who made his living reading water and weather, who could sense a storm coming hours before the first cloud appeared, who could tell by the color of the river whether it was safe to cross or whether you'd be swept away. He'd learned long ago to pay attention to things other men dismissed: the way birds flew before an earthquake, the way dogs acted before a house fire, the way certain songs seemed to change the air itself. He watched the child with a mixture of respect and wariness, recognizing something in her that he'd seen in his own grandmother years ago. On the second hour, the dogs bayed closer. Not the farm dogs, these were patrol hounds, bred lean and mean, trained to track runaways and corner them, until the handlers arrived with ropes and irons. The sound was different from a farm dog's bark, sharper, hungrier, the kind of sound that made your spine go cold even if you'd done nothing wrong, because you knew what that sound meant. It meant someone was being hunted, it meant someone was about to be caught. The patrol system had been refined over decades. Dogs that could track a scent for miles, even in water. Handlers who knew every trail and crossing, who'd memorized the habits of runaways the way hunters memorize the habits of deer. A network of informants and checkpoints, toll roads and ferry crossings where papers were checked and rechecked. Curfew bells that rang at sunset and dawn, making it illegal for anyone without a pass to be on the roads. And behind it all, the law cold, precise, backed by courts and judges and the full weight of the state. If the patrol caught them now, there would be questions. Why were they traveling after curfew? Where was their pass? Why was the owner being carried on a litter instead of riding in a wagon? The overseer could probably talk their way through it. He had connections, knew which palms to grease, knew how to spin a story. But it would cost time they didn't have, and it would draw attention to this journey, attention that might lead to questions about other things, uncomfortable things, things Crow had worked hard to keep buried. The overseer stopped so fast the lantern swung wild, the flame nearly guttering out. "We turn back," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "Now, right now." The stable hand shook his head, slow and deliberate. "Can't outrun them on this ground. Mud'll take us before the dogs do." Moses nodded. "He's right, we go forward or we stand still. Going back just puts us in their teeth." The child shifted the hymn, one note lower. The tempo slowed, stretched, like pulling taffy until it thinned. The change was small but certain, like turning a key in a lock you didn't know was there. To dogs barking thin and scattered, confused, as if the scent had bent in the air or the trail had split into 3 directions at once. A gust of wind lashed through the cypresses, and the first raindrops hit hard enough to sting bare skin. What happened in that moment defied easy explanation. The dogs had been tracking with certainty, their voices unified and strong. Then, as the child's melody shifted, their unity broke. One dog veered left, another right, a third sat down and refused to move. The handlers shouted, jerked the leads, tried to force the animals back onto the scent. But the dogs were agitated, whining, circling, unable to agree on which direction to go. Later, some would say it was just the rain that the sudden storm had washed away the scent and confused the animals. Others would say the wind had shifted, carrying their scent away instead of toward the dogs. Crow would claim witchcraft, dark arts, devilry that proved the child was dangerous and corrupted. But those who were there, who heard the shift in the melody and saw the dog's instant confusion, knew it was something else, not supernatural, not magic. Just knowledge, old knowledge, passed down through generations, about how sound affected animals, about what frequencies made dogs uncertain, about how to use your voice as a tool the same way you might use a stick or a stone. The child's grandmother had known these things, had learned them from her grandmother, who'd learned them from hers, stretching back through time to people who'd lived in different lands under different skies, of who'd known that survival sometimes depended on your ability to confuse, to misdirect, to make the hunters uncertain just long enough for the hunted to slip away. The overseer stared at the child, his mouth open, his eyes wide and shining in the lantern light. "What did you do?" She didn't answer. She only hummed, and the dogs fell silent. The squall came fast after that, sheets of rain that turned the path to soup and bent the low branches until they scraped the ground. Water poured off the brim of the overseer's hat. The stable hand wrapped his jacket around the owner's head to keep the rain from drowning him where he lay. They pushed deeper into the swamp because turning back meant meeting the patrol head-on, and nobody wanted that. Rain hit their faces and filled their mouths, but nobody swallowed. The thirst was too deep for rainwater. Their bodies wanted something from the ground, something that had minerals and weight. Rainwater was too thin, too empty. It wet your mouth, but didn't satisfy the deeper thirst, the one that came from days of dehydration, from the slow drying out that happened when you worked in fields under a brutal sun with nothing to drink but a shared tin cup. The storm turned the swamp into a roaring chaos. Lightning split the sky, turning everything white for an instant before plunging them back into darkness so complete it felt solid. Thunder rolled through the trees, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The rain came sideways, driven by wind that bent the smaller trees nearly double. And everywhere was water falling from above, rising from below, running in streams and rivulets, pooling in every depression. They could barely see 3 feet ahead. The lantern was useless, its flame drowned despite the glass. They moved by feel, by faith, by following the child's humming because it was the only steady thing in a world gone mad with storm. By the time the storm eased, they were lost. Moses admitted it plainly, standing in water up to his shins, turning in a slow circle. "Channels don't match my memory," he said. "Everything's shifted since I pulled logs through here. Trees fall, water rises, land sinks, nothing stays where you left it." The swamp was like that, constantly changing, constantly rearranging itself. A channel that ran clear one year might be choked with deadfall the next. An island of solid ground might sink into the mud, or a new one might rise. The old landmarks, the trees marked with axe blazes, the peculiar shaped stumps, the standing stones could vanish or be moved by the slow, patient work of water and time. Moses had been working this swamp for 30 years, had ferried lumber out when the logging was good, had guided hunting parties when rich men wanted to shoot ducks and pretend they were frontiersmen, had helped more than a few runaways find their way through when the roots on solid ground were too dangerous. He knew the swamp better than most men knew their own parlors. And he was telling them plainly that he was lost, that the rules he'd relied on no longer apply, that they were at the mercy of the land itself. They found shelter under a leaning cypress, its roots twisted into a hollow space barely big enough for all of them to crouch inside. The ground was drier there, not dry, but less wet, and the canopy kept the worst of the drip off their heads. The owner's breathing was shallow and fast, each inhale a rattling gasp. His eyes rolled back white, and his lips moved without sound, forming words no one could hear or understand. Dinah knelt beside him, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She checked his pulse at his neck, at his wrist, under his jaw. She lifted his eyelids and looked at his pupils. She pressed her palm to his forehead, then to his chest, feeling the heat radiating from his skin like a stove. Then she sat back and looked at the others, her face grave. He won't last another day like this. To fever's too high, his heart's racing too fast. His body's trying to burn itself out. The overseer's face went pale. Fix him. Dinah shook her head slowly. I can ease him. Can't fix him. Not without medicine. I don't have. Not without cool water and rest and time. This fever's in deep. Needs more than herbs. Then what good are you? Crow's voice was sharp with fear and anger. Dinah looked at him with eyes that had seen too much to be intimidated by posturing. I'm the difference between him dying tonight and dying tomorrow. You want me to walk away? Say the word. The overseer looked away first. He always did. The midwife appeared just after dawn, stepping out of the mist like she'd been walking alongside them the whole time. But of course she had been there all along, crouched in the hollow of the cypress with the rest of them, working through the night to keep the owner alive while the storm raged and the swamp tried to swallow them whole. The light that filtered through the morning fog was gray and thin, turning everything ghostly. Dinah worked by feel as much as sight, her fingers measuring portions of herbs she'd kept dry in oilskin pouches, crushing leaves between her palms to release their essences, mixing them with water she'd collected in a tin pot no bigger than a fist. She carried a bundle of herbs tied with string and worked with the focused intensity of someone who knew that every motion mattered, that there was no room for error or waste. Sent from the quarters, she said, though no one had asked. She often narrated her work, as if speaking it aloud made it more real, more solid, more likely to succeed. Tracking the yarrow and sage you need for a fever this hot, the overseer started to speak something about witchcraft or foolishness or how they didn't need her kind, but she cut him off with a look that could have stopped a mule mid-kick. He'll die without steam and calm breathing, she said flatly. You want him dead. Keep talking. You want him breathing. Shut your mouth and let me work. Crow's jaw worked like he was chewing words he couldn't spit out. But he shut his mouth and stepped back, because even he recognized that whatever power he had over life and death on the plantation, here in the swamp with the owner dying by inches, Dinah held more. The child watched the midwife's hands. The way she crushed the leaves between her palms, releasing the smell sharp and green and bitter, like medicine should smell, like something strong enough to fight death. The way she poured water into the pot, barely 2 fingers worth, precious as gold because even after the storm, fresh water was scarce and what they'd collected in their cupped hands and rain-soaked clothes was barely enough to wet their throats, let alone cook with. The way she set the pot over a tiny flame built from dry moss and a piece of flint struck against a stone. The flame was barely bigger than a thumbnail, but in the damp morning air it seemed miraculous that it caught it all. Dinah fed it carefully, adding strands of moss one at a time, letting it grow slowly until it was strong enough to heat the pot. The steam rose thin and sweet, curling in the dim light like a living thing. It smelled of sage and yarrow and something else the child couldn't name, something that made her throat ease and her breathing deepen without her realizing it. Sing something slow, the midwife said to the child without looking up. Something that makes his chest drop instead of climb. Something that tells the body to rest instead of fight. The child understood immediately. The 4-note hymn was for walking, for steadying, for keeping people moving when they wanted to stop. But this was different. This required a different song, one that pulled down instead of pushed forward, one that said sleep and safety and let go. She sang a lullaby. Not the hymn, something older, simpler, passed down from her grandmother's grandmother, a song with no words, just sounds that meant sleep and safety and the promise of morning. The melody moved like water, slow and inevitable, each note flowing into the next with no sharp edges, no surprises. It was the kind of song you could disappear into, the kind that made your eyelids heavy and your muscles relax and your racing thoughts slow down enough to catch. The owner's trembling eased, his breath matched the tempo, slowing from a gallop to a walk, from a walk to a measured pace, from panic to something approaching rest. His fingers, which had been clutching at nothing, loosened and fell to his sides, the tension in his jaw released. His eyelids, which had been twitching and rolling, stilled. The midwife held the pot near his face and let the steam settle into his lungs, loosening the tightness there. She'd placed crushed herbs directly on a cloth, which she laid across his chest, and now she poured a few drops of the herbal water between his cracked lips, massaging his throat to help him swallow. Won't cure him, she said quietly. speaking to the group but mostly to herself, narrating what she was doing and why, teaching even in crisis because that's what knowledge keepers did. But it'll buy time, bring the fever down a few degrees, ease the breathing, let his body remember how to fight. That's all we can do. The rest is up to him and the Lord and whatever strength he's got left. At dawn they moved again, thirstier and weaker, their lips cracked and their tongues thick in their mouths. The brief respite under the cypress had helped the owner, but it had done nothing for the rest of them. Their water was gone, their food nearly gone, their bodies running on reserves that were themselves nearly depleted. The overseer looked at the child with something like calculation in his eyes and said, "You're useful until sunrise. After that, I'll leave you if I have to. Don't slow us down." It was a threat and a promise and a revelation of how Crow's mind worked. He saw people as tools, as means to ends, as things to be used and discarded when they no longer served his purposes. The child had proven useful, had confused the dogs, had kept the group moving with her hymn, had calmed the mule. But utility was temporary. The moment she became a burden instead of an asset, she'd be abandoned. The stable hand didn't say anything, but his hand rested on the child's shoulder as they walked, a small weight that meant protection. Sam had no illusions about his ability to stop Crow if the overseer decided to make good on his threat, but he could slow him down, could argue, could position himself between the child and harm. It wasn't much, but it was something. Moses caught Sam's eye and gave a small nod, an acknowledgement of sheer understanding. The boatman would help too, if it came to that. Between the two of them, they might be able to protect the child, might. In the swamp, with Crow armed and desperate, nothing was certain. Day one in the swamp passed without water found. The boatman pointed out old ferry poles half buried in the mud, their tops worn smooth by rope and weather. "Used to run lumber through here," he said, running his hand over the weathered woe. 20 years back, when the timber was good. Had a whole system, crews cutting inland, mules dragging the logs to the water, polemen floating them downriver to the mill. Made good money for a while. What happened? Sam asked. Moses shrugged. Same thing that always happens. Cut all the good trees, prices dropped, mill closed. Men moved on to other work or other places, swamp reclaimed what we'd clear. Now you'd never know there was industry here unless you knew what to look for, but the channels didn't run where Moses expected. The landmarks he remembered: a split oak, a stone outcrop, a particular stand of cypress that formed a natural corridor were gone or changed. The oak had fallen, leaving a tangle of dead branches jutting from the water like bones. The stone outcrop was half submerged, water having risen or the ground having sunk, either way making it invisible until you were almost on top of it. The cypress corridor had been choked by new growth, smaller trees and dense underbrush that made passage impossible. Twice they nearly sank, the mud grabbing at their ankles and calves, pulling them down with a slow, patient hunger. The first time, it was Moses who went in, stepping on what looked like solid ground only to feel it give way beneath him. He shouted, arms windmilling, and Sam grabbed him before he went in deeper, the two of them straining and pulling until Moses came free with a wet sucking sound, minus one boot that the mud kept as its prize. The second time it was Dinah. She was smaller, lighter, but that almost worked against her. The mud got a grip on her faster, pulled her down to her thighs before anyone realized what was happening. It took all three men pulling together to get her out, and even then they nearly lost her medicine bag, which would have been a catastrophe. She spent the next hour limping and cursing under her breath, checking her pouches to make sure nothing had been ruined by the wet. Once the mule balked and wouldn't move, its eyes rolling white, its whole body trembling. Animals knew things people didn't, had instincts that picked up on dangers that weren't visible or obvious. Whatever the mule sensed: a sinkhole just ahead, a snake in the branches, some other threat. It was enough to make the animal plant its feet and refuse to budge. The stable hand yanked the rope and cursed, frustration boiling over. They'd been walking for hours without rest, were lost in a swamp that seemed to be actively working against them, and now the one animal they were counting on to carry the owner decided to quit. The overseer raised his hand to strike, his face twisted with anger and fear. The child stepped forward and stroked the mule's neck. She hummed, soft and low, the four-note melody, but gentler, slower, more soothing than urgent. Her hand moved in long, steady strokes, and she pressed her forehead against the mule's cheek, sharing breath, sharing space, sharing calm. The animal's trembling stopped, its eyes stopped rolling, the whites disappearing as the panic faded. It let out a long breath, a sound like relief, and turned its head to nuzzle the child's shoulder. Then it followed her hand like she held sugar or oats, even though her palm was empty, stepping carefully around whatever danger had sensed, trusting her to lead it safe. Crow watched with narrowed eyes. He was a man who believed in dominance, in force, in breaking resistance through pain and fear. The child's method, gentle, patient, based on connection rather than coercion, didn't fit his worldview, which meant it was either useless nonsense or something he didn't understand. And things Crow didn't understand made him nervous. "Lucky touch," he muttered, but nobody believed him, least of all himself. In the late afternoon, when the light turned gold and heavy, slanting through the Spanish moss in thick beams that looked solid enough to touch, the child stopped walking. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted like she was listening to something no one else could hear. She watched the angle of sunlight slanting through the Spanish moss, the way it hit the water and bent, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted and changed as the wind moved the branches. Then she pointed left, no words, no explanation, just one finger raised and steady, and started walking. The others followed because they had no better plan. Moses didn't recognize the route, couldn't see any landmark or feature that marked it as different from any other direction. That the ground firmed under their feet, they didn't sink. The path widened just enough for the mule to walk without stumbling. The branches that had been scraping their faces and catching their clothes seemed to pull back, giving them passage. The overseer spat into the dirt. "Lucky guess," he muttered. The stable hand said nothing, but his eyes stayed on the child, watching the way she moved, careful, certain, like she was reading a map written in air, like she could see something the rest of them couldn't, or hear something, or know something through whatever mysterious means her grandmother had taught her. Sam had spent his whole life reading the land, knowing where the water would pool after rain, where the soil was rich enough to grow tobacco, where the gullies would wash out in storms. But this was different. The child wasn't reading the land the way he understood it. She was reading something else, patterns of light, maybe, or sounds too subtle for his ears, or memories passed down through songs that encoded information about how to navigate when you were lost. When the sun dropped and the shadows pooled like spilled ink, turning the whole swamp into a landscape of darkness barely touched by the last fading light, the child's finger stayed lifted, pointing ahead, like she was following a sound only she could hear, a melody no one else knew, a map written in music that only she could read. They walked until full dark, until even the child couldn't see where to step safely, until Crow finally admitted they had to stop, or risk breaking an ankle or walking into water deep enough to drown in. They made camp, if you could call it that, in another hollow beneath another cypress, the ground marginally less but than everywhere else, their bodies huddled together for warmth as the night temperature dropped. No fire. Too risky with the patrol somewhere in the swamp, their dogs still searching even if confused. They ate the last of the cornbread in darkness, each person's portion barely enough to constitute a meal. The baby whimpered, too weak to cry properly, and the child shared her portion with him, chewing the bread until it was soft enough for him to gum down. Nobody spoke. They were too tired, too thirsty, too aware of how precarious their situation had become. The owner's breathing had eased somewhat after Dinah's treatment, but it was still ragged, still wrong. Dinah herself looked exhausted, her face drawn and her movements slow. Moses's missing boot meant his foot was wrapped in rags, and he was already limping. Sam's shoulder ached from pulling people out of the mud and steadying the litter. Even Crow, for all his bluster, looked haggard and afraid. The child hummed, not the walking melody, not the lullaby, but something else, something that felt like comfort without demanding anything, like presence without pressure, like the musical equivalent of a hand on your shoulder saying you're not alone. One by one, the others fell asleep to that sound, their breathing sensing to its rhythm, their bodies relaxing despite everything. The child stayed awake longer, keeping watch not because anyone had asked her to but because she felt responsible somehow, felt like the hymn her grandmother had given her was more than just music, was a kind of guardianship, a promise to keep singing as long as people needed steadiness. Her baby brother slept against her chest, his breathing soft and even now that he'd had a little food and water. She hummed to him, to the sleeping adults, to the swamp itself, like she was negotiating with the land, asking it to let them pass, to show mercy to people who were just trying to survive. Night 1 brought the patrollers close again. A lantern glowed through the fog, maybe 200 paces out, its light diffuse and eerie, turning the mist into a luminous wall that revealed nothing clearly but suggested everything. The lantern swung in time with footsteps measured, steady, the pace of men who were used to walking long distances, who could keep it up for hours without tiring. The dogs snuffled and whined, pulling their handler in slow circles, confused by the scent trails that crossed and doubled back. The storm had complicated everything, washing away some scents and concentrating others, creating false trails that led nowhere and dead ends that suggested travelers had simply vanished into thin air. The patrol handler was a man named Silas Webb, a professional tracker who'd been doing this work for 15 years and knew every trick runaways try. He'd learned to read disturbed earth, to spot bent grass that hadn't yet sprung back, to recognize the signs of passage that most people would miss. But even with all his experience, he found this trail frustrating. His dogs were good, the best he'd ever worked with, bred from championship lines and trained with methods he'd refined over years. They should have been able to track through the storm, through the water, through anything short of a complete washout. But they kept circling, kept contradicting each other, kept acting like the scent was there and then wasn't, was strong and then vanished. Webb had heard stories about people who could confuse dogs' old tales about particular songs or sounds, about herbs rubbed on skin, about tricks that seemed like superstition, until you ran into them in the field and realized there might be something to it after all. He didn't believe in magic, didn't think there was anything supernatural involved, but he'd learned to respect folk knowledge, to recognize that people who lived close to the land often knew things that seemed impossible until you saw them work. Now his dogs were telling him something was wrong, something was off, something was interfering with their ability to track. And Webb, for all his skill and experience, couldn't figure out what it was or how to counter it. The boatman pressed his hand over the child's mouth, not hard, just firm enough to remind her to be silent, and pointed at the ground. Everyone crouched low, knees in the mud, breath held. The slightest sound could give them away. The snapping of a twig, the splash of water, even the rasp of cloth against cloth might be enough to draw the patroller's attention. The child reached for the ribbon tied around her wrist. The ribbon her grandmother had given her, the ribbon she'd worn for 3 years now, the ribbon that had absorbed sweat and rain and tears and still held together. Its blue color faded to almost gray, but its fibers still strong. She unwound it carefully and wrapped it around the lantern handle. Then she tilted the light 3 times, up, down, sigh, a false signal. A pattern that meant nothing but looked like something like a code, like instructions, like a message from one patrol to another. The pattern was deliberate, calculated. The child had watched the patrollers work before, had seen them signal to each other across distances when they were coordinating a search. 3 tilts in that particular pattern meant found the trail, heading northeast, follow at a distance. It was a lie, but it was a lie that would sound true to anyone who knew the code. The patroller's lantern swung toward the signal, hesitated, then moved away, chasing the wrong direction. The dogs followed, their barking fading into the trees, drawn by their handler's certainty that he was on to something. Webb's voice called out something about river crossings and checking the north bend, his words carrying through the fog before fading into distance and silence. When the footsteps were gone and the night settled back into its own sounds, frogs and insects, and the soft plop of something sliding into water, the normal sounds of the swamp at night, Crow moved with sudden violence. The overseer grabbed the ribbon off the lantern and stuffed it into his coat pocket. His fingers were rough and quick, like he was stealing something valuable, which in a sense he was. The child had just demonstrated knowledge that could be useful, knowledge of patrol signals, knowledge of how to misdirect searches, knowledge that might be worth money or leverage or survival. "That trick belongs to me now," he said, his voice low and mean, with an edge that promised consequences if she objected. The child didn't argue, didn't try to take the ribbon back, didn't plead or cry or protest. She just looked at him with those steady, unblinking eyes, dark and deep and far older than her 9 or 10 years, and the overseer looked away first, his face flushing with an anger that might have been shame but refused to acknowledge itself as such. Sam watched the exchange with cold calculation. He was marking it down, adding it to the list of Crow's offenses, filing it away for a day, when accounts would be settled. He didn't say anything now, couldn't, not without provoking a confrontation they couldn't afford, in the middle of the swamp with patrollers nearby. But he filed it away, and Crow knew he'd filed it away, and that knowledge sat between them like a debt, unpaid. Day 2 brought hunger sharper than thirst, the kind that made your belly cramp and your head swim, that made you see things that weren't there and hear sounds that couldn't be real. The kind of hunger that came from running your body on empty, from burning through the last reserves of fat and muscle, from crossing the line where your body started consuming itself to keep moving. The owner could barely lift his head from the litter. His lips were cracked and bleeding, split so deeply the cracks wouldn't close even when he pressed them together. His tongue was swollen, too big for his mouth, and when he tried to speak, only croaking sounds came out, words half-formed and meaningless. The midwife gave him the last of the herb water, tipping the tin cup against his mouth drop by precious drop, and he swallowed it like a man drinking dust, his throat working convulsively, his body desperate for moisture in any form. Dinah looked at the empty cup and then the swamp around them, all that water, all that standing brown liquid that smelled of rot and minerals and things dead and decaying, and none of it drinkable. The irony was almost cruel, surrounded by water, dying of thirst. It was like drowning in air, like starving in a granary, like every nightmare of abundance that couldn't be accessed. The overseer's cruelty turned hot and specific, the way it always did when he was afraid and trying to mask it with anger. He threatened to burn the quarters, Bible, and they got back the one with the torn cover and the water-stained pages that the preacher's wife kept wrapped in oilcloth, the one that held birth dates and marriage records and death notices in its margins, the one that was sometimes the only proof people had existed at all. Threatened to burn the old quilt she'd sewn, the one with hymn verses stitched into the border in thread so fine you had to hold it up to the light to read. The one that served as a record of songs that couldn't be written down in books because books could be taken but fabric could be hidden, could be worn, could be passed from hand to hand without attracting attention. If the girl keeps switching, he said, pointing at the child with a finger that trembled slightly, betraying the fear beneath the anger, I'll burn it all. Every scrap, every word. I'll make sure there's nothing left, nothing to remember, nothing to pass on. All those precious songs and stories, all that careful work, Ash, all of it. The midwife didn't flinch. She'd heard worse threats from better men, had outlived overseers who'd promised her destruction, had watched powerful people die while she kept on living and working and teaching and passing on knowledge they couldn't touch no matter how much they threatened. She kept walking, her bundle of herbs clutched against her chest, her feet finding purchase on ground that should have been too treacherous to walk on. Swamp'll take us all before you get the chance, she said quietly, without heat, just stating a fact. And it won't care about your threats or your fires. Swamp doesn't care about any of us. The child hummed a verse nobody recognized. Different from the four-note melody she'd been singing, different from the lullaby or the walking song. This one had more notes, a longer line, a pattern that twisted and turned like a river finding its way to the sea, like a path through woods that looped back on itself before suddenly opening into clarity. The stable hand jerked his head up, his eyes going wide. I know that, he whispered, his voice rough with surprise and something else, recognition, memory, emotion he thought he'd forgotten. Heard it years ago, under a porch, at a blessing. The overseer turned slow, his boots squelching in the mud, his face a mask of suspicion and calculation. What kind of blessing? The stable hand didn't answer. His throat worked like he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words, or maybe like he knew the words, but knew better than to speak them where Crow could hear. Whatever that blessing had been, whatever that song meant, it was something private, something sacred, something that wasn't for the overseer to know. Sam's mind had gone back 20 years, to a night when he was barely more than a beau, to a wedding that wasn't legally a wedding because the law didn't recognize such things between enslaved people, but which was real nonetheless. Real because the people involved promised themselves to each other, real because a preacher spoke words over them, real because a community witnessed and acknowledged the bond. He'd hidden under the porch during the ceremony, not supposed to be there, but curious and young and wanting to see. The preacher's wife had sung a song, this song, the one the child was humming now, and he'd known even then, young as he was, that he was hearing something important, something that mattered in ways he didn't fully understand. That couple had been separated 6 months later, sold to different buyers to settle debts. The wife had been pregnant at the time, had begged not to be taken until after the baby was born, had been taken anyway. Sam didn't know what happened to her, to the baby, to the husband who'd stood and watched his family taken and couldn't do anything to stop it. But he remembered the song, had carried it in his memory all these years, a fragment of melody he'd never been able to complete, never knew the full shape of. And now this child was singing it, no perfect, as if she'd been at that ceremony herself, which was impossible because she hadn't been born yet. That night, when they stopped to rest under a stand of pines, the ground slightly higher there, slightly drier, offering what little shelter the swamp was willing to give, the stable hand whispered to the child, "Sing it again." She did. Note for note, perfect, her voice never wavered, never rushed, never forgot a single turn of the melody. It was like she was reading from a page that only she could see, like the song was written somewhere permanent, and she was simply transcribing it from memory. It couldn't fail. The stable hand closed his eyes and listened, and something in his face cracked open. Grief, or memory, or both, the kind of pain that had calcified over years suddenly exposed and raw again. Tears ran down his face, cutting tracks through the dirt and sweat, and he didn't wipe them away, just let them fall while he listened to a song that carried 20 years of grief and loss and promises that should have been kept but weren't. The others watched in silence. Dinah's face was soft with understanding. She'd seen this before, had seen how songs could unlock things that had been sealed away, could make people remember what they'd been trying to forget. Moses nodded slowly, recognizing that something significant was happening even if he didn't know the specific story. Even Crow was quiet, though his silence was watchful and calculating rather than respectful. When the child finished, Sam opened his eyes and looked at her with a mixture of wonder and questions he couldn't voice. How did she know that song? Who taught her? What else did she carry in that small body? What other memories and melodies and pieces of history that should have been lost but somehow survived? But he didn't ask. Some things were better left unspoken, especially with Crow listening. So he just nodded to her, a gesture of thanks and acknowledgement and respect, and she nodded back, understanding passing between them without words. Dawn of day 3 found them all failing. The baby's lips were cracked and bleeding, tiny fissures that wouldn't heal, that oozed clear fluid and then blood when he cried, which he barely had the strength to do anymore. The mule's ribs showed hard through its coat, each bone a ridge under the skin, the animal's head hanging low, its step slow and uncertain. The owner's fever had burned so long his skin felt like paper, thin and dry, ready to tear at the slightest touch. His pulse was a flutter under the midwife's fingers, weak and irregular, sometimes racing impossibly fast and then slowing to almost nothing, his heart struggling to find a rhythm it could sustain. Dinah's herbs were gone. Her water was gone. She had nothing left to give except her presence, her hands on his chest feeling for breath, her voice soft and steady telling him to hold on, to fight, to not give up yet. But she could see in his face that he was slipping away, that his body had endured as much as it could endure, that they were running out of time. They'd been in the swamp for 3 days. 3 days with almost no food, with water that was either too little or too foul to drink, with no rest except stolen moments of exhausted sleep. Their clothes were stiff with dried mud and sweat. Their skin was rubbed dry in places where fabric had chafed repeatedly. Their feet were blister and bleeding inside boots that squelched with water that never dry. Moses's missing boot had become a serious problem. The rags he'd wrapped around his foot kept coming loose, kept slipping, and now the sole of his foot was cut in multiple places from sharp branches and stones hidden in the mud. He was limping badly, favoring the injured foot, and Sam knew it was only a matter of time before infection set in, if they didn't find help soon. The child herself was reaching her limits. She'd been carrying her baby brother almost constantly for 3 days, had been humming almost without stop, had been leading them through a landscape that should have been impossible to navigate. The strain showed in her face, in the dark circles under her eyes, in the way her steps had become mechanical, automatic, like she was moving on pure will because her body had nothing left to give. But she kept humming, kept moving, kept leading them forward because stopping meant dying, and she wasn't ready to accept that yet. The child stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the path, staring at a rotted log half sunk in the mud. The log was black with age, covered in moss and mushrooms, collapsing into itself. It had been dead for years, decades maybe, slowly decomposing, returning to the soul from which it had grown. There was nothing remarkable about it. The swamp was full of such logs, each one marking where a tree had fallen and begun its long transformation back into earth. She tilted her head, listening or seeing or knowing something the rest of them didn't. Her eyes traced the log's length, noting how it lay, how the moss grew thicker on one side, how the mushrooms clustered near one end. She watched the way water pooled around it, the way the mud looked different on one side versus the other. Then she whispered, "There." One word. barely audible, but spoken with absolute certainty. The boatman didn't believe her. Moses looked at the log, at the mud, at the child, and shook his head slowly. "Ain't nothing there but rot," he said, kindly enough but firmly, the way you'd speak to a child who thought they saw something that couldn't possibly be real. "Log's been dead 20 years or more. Nothing under it but more mud." The overseer laughed, a short, bitter sound edged with hysteria. They'd been walking for 3 days on the word of a child, following her hunches and her humming, and now she was pointing at a rotten log and claiming water was underneath it. It was absurd. It was desperate. It was the kind of thing you did when you were out of options and grasping at anything that might offer hope, no matter how unlikely. "Girl's finally lost her sense," Crow said, his voice carrying a note of something almost like relief that she'd finally been proven wrong, that her strange knowledge had run up against reality and failed, that he could dismiss her as deluded and not have to wonder any more about how she knew the things she knew. But the stable hand knelt without a word. Sam didn't debate, didn't question, didn't argue. He just dropped to his knees in the mud and pried at the log with both hands, his fingers digging into the soft wood, his shoulders straining as he worked to roll the massive piece of timber free from the mud that had claimed it. The log rolled free with a wet sucking sound, loud in the morning quiet, and underneath, the sand shifted and darkened. Water bubbled up, clear and cold, threading through the sand like veins, like blood from a wound, like life emerging from death, a spring. Hidden, unexpected, impossible but real. The water came from deep in the earth, filtered through layers of sand and stone, until it emerged pure and cold, untainted by the swamp's rot. It flowed gently, almost tentatively at first, as if testing whether it was safe to emerge into the world. Then stronger, more confidently, creating a small pool that deepened as they watched. For a moment, nobody moved. They just stared at the water, barely able to believe what they were seeing. Then, as one, they broke. The whole party drank. They fell to their knees in the mud and cupped their hands and drank until their bellies ached, until they'd had so much water they felt sick with it, until the desperate thirst that had been clawing at them for days finally eased. The water was cold, shockingly cold, after the swamp's warm stagnancy. It tasted mineral, slightly metallic, the taste of deep earth and stone. It was the best water any of them had ever tasted, better than wine, better than anything, because it meant life when they'd been staring at death. The midwife soaked a cloth and pressed it to the owner's lips, squeezing water into his mouth drop by drop, careful not to choke him, patient even though she wanted to pour it down his throat, to flood his body with the moisture it desperately needed. He swallowed weakly at first, then more strongly, his body recognizing what it needed and reaching for it. The baby sucked on a wet rag and cried for the first time in 2 days, a thin wail that sounded like hope, like life returning, like the sound of something that had nearly broken but found the strength to keep going. The child held him close and let him drink, let him take as much as he needed, and for the first time in days, she smiled. Others arrived within the hour. Field hands who'd been sent to search, and the group didn't return when it became clear something had gone wrong. Neighbors who'd heard the commotion and followed the sound of voices raised in surprise and joy at the sound of people who'd been dying and were suddenly, improbably, saved. They drank too, kneeling in the mud, their hands shaking, their voices rising in thanks and disbelief. Someone said the word aloud. "Miracle," another voice answered, "Him that held the water." The word spread. The child had led them to water, had found a spring where no spring should be, in the middle of the swamp, under a rotted log, exactly where she'd said it would be. And she'd done it by humming, by following something no one else could sense, by knowing things she shouldn't have been able to know. Some called it gift, some called it sight. Crow called it witchcraft, but quietly now, because there were too many witnesses, too many people who'd seen what happened, too many people who owed their lives to the child's knowledge. By afternoon, the spring slowed, the flow thinned to a trickle, then to damp sand, then to nothing. By nightfall it was just mud again, the same as the rest of the swamp, as if the spring had opened just long enough to save them and then closed, its purpose fulfilled. The temporary nature of the spring added to its mystique. If it had been permanent, people might have called it luck, a spring that happened to be there, that the child happened to find. But this was different. The spring appeared, gave what was needed, and vanished. It felt like intervention, like mercy, like the land itself had bent its rules for one brief moment before returning to its normal indifference. When the last trickle died, The child began the strange verse again, the one the stable hand had recognized, the porch blessing song, the melody that twisted and turned and meant something more than just notes, but this time she sang it differently. Not like a song, like a map, like instructions, like a path drawn in sound, each note a landmark, each phrase a direction, each verse a step on a journey that had already been traveled by others, but which needed to be traveled again. Sam listened with his whole body, not just his ears. He let the melody move through him, let it settle into his bones, and as it did, he began to understand. The song was describing a route. Not in words, there were no words, but in the rising and falling of notes, in the spaces between phrases, in the rhythm that matched footsteps, in the patterns that encoded information, the way quilts encoded information, the way stories encoded information, the way knowledge was passed when it couldn't be written down. Turn where the river bends, follow the star that doesn't move, count 3 churches, wait for the signal, trust the lantern that blinks twice. The song held all of it, held centuries of knowledge about how to move through hostile territory, how to find help, how to survive when the law said you shouldn't be allowed to survive. Sam had heard pieces of it before, fragments in other songs, echoes in other melodies. But he'd never heard it complete, never understood that it was a map, never realized that people had been singing directions to freedom right out in the open where anyone could hear but only a few could understand. The child sang it through 3 times, and with each repetition, Sam understood more. By the 3rd time, he could have walked the route himself, could have followed the path the song described, could have guided others along it. The knowledge was in him now, encoded in melody, protected by memory, passed on the way it had been passed for generations, from voice to voice, from song to song, from one person who needed to know to another who would need to know next. They made it back to the plantation edges by the next morning, stumbling and scraped, clothes stiff with dried mud, but alive. Every one of them breathing, every one of them having survived what should have killed them, the swamp, the thirst, the fever, the patrol, all of it. The morning sun hit them like a benediction as they emerged from the tree line. After 3 days in the green dimness of the swamp, the open sky felt enormous, the light almost painful in its brightness. Birds sang in the fields, normal birds, not the strange cries of swamp creatures. The air smelled different, like growing things instead of rot, like dust and tobacco instead of mount and stagnant water. The overseer strutted ahead, his chest puffed out, already spinning the story in his favor before they even crossed the property line. His mind worked quickly, reshaping the narrative, erasing the parts that made him look weak or frightened or dependent, amplifying the parts that made him look strong and decisive and in control. Leadership, he said loudly, to anyone within earshot, to the field hands watching from the tobacco rows, their work forgotten as they stared at the group emerging from the swamp like ghosts returning from the dead. To the cookhouse women shading their eyes against the morning sun, trying to see who'd made it back and who hadn't. To anyone who would listen and carry the story forward. Took them into the swamp when no one else would, made the hard decisions, kept them alive when the fever should have taken him, brought them all back breathing. Every single one, not a loss. That's leadership. That's what it takes to manage in crisis. He didn't mention the child, didn't mention the hymn that kept them steady, the melody that confused the dogs, the way she'd calmed the mule and found the spring and led them through paths that shouldn't have been navigable. Didn't mention how many times he'd wanted to turn back, how many times his decisions would have gotten them killed if others hadn't quietly countermanded them. He claimed it all as his own doing, his strength, his decisions, his will that bent the swamp to mercy. And because he was the overseer, because he held power, because people were used to believing the official version of events even when they knew it was a lie, his version would be the one that went into the record books, the one that would be told in the big house, the one that would justify his position and his salary and his continued authority. The owner lay in the back of the wagon, his fever broken but his strength not yet returned. Sweat still beaded on his forehead, though it was cool now, the sweat of recovery rather than crisis. His eyes were clear for the first time in days, focused, tracking movement, taking in the world around him with awareness that had been absent during the fever's grip. He watched the child through half-closed lids as she walked beside the wagon, her baby brother still balanced on her hip. She'd carried that child for 3 days through hell, had never put him down except to drink or to shift him from one hip to the other, had kept him alive through sheer stubborn refusal to let him die. Her lips were cracked worse than before, split at the corners and crusted with dry blood that pulled when she moved her mouth. Her feet were bare and bleeding, every step leaving a small print of red in the dust. Her dress was torn in 3 places, caked with mud and swamp water and things best not examined too closely. But she was alive. They were all alive. And the owner knew with the clarity that sometimes comes after brush with death that it wasn't Crow's leadership that had saved them. It was this small girl with her strange knowing and her hymns that held more than music. Guilt wormed through the owner's chest, small and sharp, and impossible to ignore. He'd seen her lead them. Seen her calm the mule, quiet the dogs, find water where there should have been none. Seen her give her food to her brother. Seen her hum until her voice was raw. Seen her keep moving when everyone else wanted to stop. And he'd done nothing to protect her from the overseer's threats, from Crow's theft of her ribbon, from the casual cruelty that marked every interaction between the powerful and the powerless on his plantation. When the overseer raised his voice again, pointing at the child and announcing she'd better keep her mouth shut about what happened in the swamp or there'd be consequences, fire and the lash, and worse, consequences that would extend to everyone she cared about, consequences that would make the swamp look like mercy, the owner lifted one hand. The movement was weak, trembling, barely more than a twitch of fingers, but it carried weight. The weight of authority, of ownership, of power that even fever couldn't completely strip away. "Stop," he said. His voice came out hoarse and cracked, barely more than a whisper, but every person in the yard heard it. Sound carried strange sometimes, and this was one of those times. The single word seemed to hang in the air, seemed to demand attention and response. The overseer froze mid-sentence, his finger still pointed at the child, his mouth still open on words that now went unspoken. "Let her be," the owner said. 2 words, just 2. That they created a boundary, drew a line, established that there would be no punishment, no retribution, no consequences for the child who'd saved all their lives. It wasn't much, didn't free her, didn't change her status, didn't undo the fundamental injustice of her situation. But in that moment, it was enough to stop Crow's immediate threat. The overseer's face, red, then pale. His jaw worked like he was chewing words too bitter to swallow. He opened his mouth to argue, to push back, to assert his authority against the owner's weakened state. But the owner's eyes stayed fixed on him, fever bright but utterly focused, and whatever Crow saw there made him swallow his words and step back. It was a minor victory, a temporary reprieve. Everyone in the yard knew Crow would find other ways to punish perceived insubordination, other times, when the owner wasn't watching, other methods that couldn't be directly traced back to this moment. But for now, the child was safe. For now, the line had been drawn. The child didn't react, didn't thank the owner or acknowledge the protection. She wasn't naive enough to think this changed anything fundamental. The system was still the system, the power dynamics were still the power dynamics. One moment of protection didn't undo a lifetime of vulnerability. She only hummed, low and steady, and the melody pointed away from home, away from the quarters and the big house and the fields, toward something else, toward a possibility that hadn't existed 3 days ago, which was starting to take shape, starting to become real. The hymn's verse matched the land in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The stable hand noticed it first. They were walking the edge of the property, near the old boundary stones, marking the line where the owner's land ended and the county road began. The child was humming again, not the For No Foundation, but the longer verse, the one from the porch blessing, the one that Sam had recognized. And as she hummed, something clicked in Sam's mind. He stopped dead in his tracks, his body going still, his face showing the kind of shock that comes from sudden understanding, from pieces falling into place, from seeing the pattern you'd been looking at all along but hadn't recognized until this exact moment. "That turn," he said, pointing ahead to where the path split around a bent oak. The tree had been struck by lightning years ago, split down the middle but still alive, one half leaning at a 45-degree angle while the other grew straight. "That's in the song." The others stopped. Moses cocked his head, listening to the child's humming with new attention. Dinah's eyes narrowed, recognizing something she'd suspected but never confirmed. Sam listened to the next phrase and then walked forward, counting his steps, 20 paces. "Turn right where the fence post stood, an old post, weathered gray, marking where a property line used to run before parcels were sold and boundaries shifted." The melody turned with him, dropped to notes, shifted rhythm. "There," he said, pointing, "that dip in the path. That's the next part of the song, that change in rhythm, that saying the ground drops. Watch your step." They continued walking, Sam following the melody like it was a map he could see with his ears. The boatman joined him, had been quiet this whole time but now spoke up, his voice certain. "That's a root co," he said quietly, like he was afraid to say it too loud, like speaking it might make it disappear or bring consequences neither of them wanted. Church folk used to sing them, for moving people safe from one place to another without getting caught. Root codes, map songs. Musical instructions encoded in melodies that sounded like hymns, sounded like spirituals, sounded like the kind of songs that enslaved people had been singing for generations right out in the open where anyone could hear. But hidden in those melodies were directions. Turn here, wait there, follow this landmark, avoid that road. Trust this person, fear that one. The knowledge had been passed down for generations, added to and refined, updated as routes change and danger shifted and new paths were discovered. It was a living document written in sound, protected by the fact that most people heard music as just music, never suspecting that the notes themselves carried meaning beyond their beauty. The child kept humming, and the melody traced a path, past the ferry poles half buried in the river bank, marking where the old crossing used to be before the new bridge was built 3 miles downriver. Past the stone marker that used to mark the county line before the boundaries shifted in some legal shuffle that no one explained to the people it affected. Past the bent oak that lightning had split years ago, but refused to kill, the tree that everyone used as a landmark for giving directions. Each natural feature, each human-made marker, each distinctive element of the landscape was encoded in the melody. A rising scale meant climbing ground, a falling scale meant descending. A repeated note meant wait, pause, look around. A trill meant danger, proceed with caution. A sustained note meant safe house, help available here. It was brilliant in its simplicity. Anyone could hear the song, anyone could sing the song. But only those who'd been taught could read the song, could extract the information and encode it in its structure, could use it to navigate from slavery to freedom, from danger to safety, from one point to another without ever needing a written map that could be confiscated or a set of directions that could be overheard. When Moses named the wrong crossing set, they should turn east toward the old mill, the one that had burned down 5 years ago, but whose ruins still stood. The child stopped humming and changed one note. Just one, a half step down instead of up, a tiny alteration that most people wouldn't even notice, would hear as a variation or a mistake, would dismiss as a child's imperfect memory. But the boatman's face cleared immediately. "No," he said slowly, understanding washing over him. "Not the mill, the true bend. I remember now. The crossing before they built the bridge, the one that's still safe because the patrols don't watch it anymore, think it's abandoned, think nobody uses it." The note had been a correction. A gentle denial, a way of saying that's not right, listen again, follow this path instead. All conveyed in the shift of a single note, in the alteration so subtle you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention, if you didn't know to listen for meaning beneath melody. They turned toward the country chapel at dusk, the group moving with new purpose, new urgency. The chapel sat alone in a clearing, surrounded by scrub pine and wild grass that grew high enough to brush their knees as they walked. Whitewashed wood, crooked steeple, no glass in the windows, just shutters that hung on leather hinges and banged in the wind, creating a rhythmic clapping sound that carried across the clearing. The building was old, older than anyone could remember. Some said it had been built by the first settlers, back when this was frontier land and churches were thrown up quickly with whatever materials came to hand. Others said it had been rebuilt 3 or 4 times, that the current structure stood on foundations that went back 100 years, that the basement was older than the building above it, carved out by hands that were dust now, used for purposes that had shifted with the generations. The chapel served the community, or at least, parts of the community. White folks held services on Sunday morning. Black folks held services on Sunday evening, after the white service was done and the building was available. The preacher served both congregations, read from the same Bible, preached versions of the same sermons, though everyone knew the messages bent slightly differently depending on the audience. But the chapel held more than just services, it held memories, records. Documents that couldn't be kept in the big house or the courthouse because they documented things the law didn't recognize or didn't approve of. Marriages between enslaved people, birth records for children whose existence was barely acknowledged, death records for people whose passing went unnoticed by official record keepers, and sometimes, very carefully, very secretly, papers that promised freedom, manumission clauses, bills of sale that freed instead of enslaving, documents that had legal weight, but which had to be hidden because making them public would invite their destruction. The overseer had followed them at a distance, watching from the tree line, his face dark with suspicion. He knew something was happening, knew the child had led them somewhere specific, knew this wasn't just a random stop on the way back from the swamp. His mind raced through possibilities, through scenarios, through ways this might threaten his carefully constructed empire of lies and theft and falsified records. He muttered as they approached the chapel, loud enough for those nearby to hear. No one goes into that basement. Nothing down there but old trunks and mildew, rats probably. Nothing worth looking at, nothing anyone needs to see. But the child walked straight to the door and waited. She didn't knock, didn't call out, didn't announce herself. Just stood there with that same patient certainty she'd shown in the swamp, waiting for what she knew was coming. The preacher met them at the threshold. Reverend Josiah Hale was old, older than anyone could remember, with hands that shook when he held the latch and eyes that had gone milky at the edges, cataracts creeping in from the corners, narrowing his vision to a tunnel that forced him to turn his whole head to see. He'd been preaching in this chapel for 40 years, had baptized and married and buried 3 generations, had kept secrets that would have destroyed families and toppled fortunes if he'd ever chosen to speak them. But when he looked at the child, he nodded once, slow and deliberate, like he'd been expecting her, like he'd been waiting for years for someone to come who knew the songs, who carried the knowledge, who could complete the puzzle he'd been holding pieces of for decades. Old hymns, he said, his voice crackling like dry leaves, rough with age and use and years of preaching in all weather, were stitched with instructions, routes and safe houses and names of folk who'd help, soon in plain daylight where everyone could hear, but only a few knew what they meant. He spoke carefully, weighing each word, aware that Crow was listening from outside, aware that anything he said might be used against him, against the child, against anyone who'd helped preserve the knowledge the songs carried. That he was old, old enough not to fear much anymore, old enough to value truth over safety, old enough to know that some things needed to be said regardless of consequences. He led them inside. The chapel was bare, rough benches made from split logs, a simple pulpit cobbled together from boards that didn't quite match, a table covered with a stained cloth that had once been white but had yellowed with age and countless washings. The floor was dirt packed hard by decades of feet, the walls showed daylight through cracks in the boards, and the roof leaked in 3 places that everyone knew to avoid when it rained. But when the preacher lifted the corner of a rag rug near the altar, a threadbare thing that nobody would have looked at twice, that seemed purely decorative or practical for catching dirt, a trapdoor appeared. Its edges were worn smooth, by years of opening and closing, by hands reaching down into darkness, by secrets being stored and retrieved and stored again. The basement smelled like clay and old paper and something sharper, dried herbs, maybe, or the ghost of candle smoke, or the accumulated scent of decades of hiding things that couldn't be kept in the light. The ceiling was so low that Sam and Moses had to duck, their heads nearly brushing the beams. The walls were earth, held back by boards that had warped and shifted but still held. The floor was packed clay, cool even in summer, stable even in the wettest seasons. Trunks lined the walls, stacked too deep, their lids marked with dates and initials that meant nothing to most people, but which told stories to those who knew how to read them. Each trunk held records, some official, some unofficial, some that existed in that gray space between legal and illegal, documented but not acknowledged. Quilts hung from nails driven into the beams, their patterns faded but still visible, stars and crosses and geometric shapes that might have been decoration or might have been something more. Log cabin patterns that showed the way to safe houses. North Star patterns that pointed direction. Underground Railroad patterns that even today, years after the routes had shifted and changed, still carried meaning to those who knew how to read them. In the corner sat a locked box, small and iron-banded, no bigger than a bread box. The kind of thing you'd use for documents you couldn't afford to lose, for papers that represented the difference between freedom and bondage, between legal recognition and invisible existence. The box had a seal impressed into the wax on the lock, red wax, but even in the dim light of the basement, something about it looked wrong. The color was off, the texture was off, the way it sat on the lock was wrong in a way that was hard to define but impossible to miss once you noticed it. The preacher climbed down the ladder slowly, his joints creaking louder than the rungs, every movement careful and deliberate. Old age had made his body unreliable, made him conscious of every step, every reach, every motion that younger bodies took for granted. The midwife followed, carrying a candle that flickered and nearly went out in the draft that came up from the basement, cool air rising to meet warm, creating currents that made the flame dance and spit. Dinah held the candle carefully, shielding it with her hand, aware that this light was their only way to see, that if it went out they'd be working in darkness with matches that might be too damp to strike. The stable hand kept one hand on the wall, his eyes darting toward the shadows like he expected something to jump out. Sem had been in enough tight spaces, enough dangerous situations, enough places where being caught meant consequences beyond imagining, that he never fully relaxed in enclosed spaces. His body was tense, ready to move, ready to fight or flee if necessary, even though rationally he knew the danger here wasn't physical. The child's perfect memory did the rest. The preacher started to recite a verse, something about morning light and safe harbor, words that might have been biblical or might have been something else entirely, something that sounded biblical, but was actually code, actually instructions disguised as scripture. But he stumbled halfway through, forgetting the words. Old age had stolen his memory in patches, leaving some things crystal clear while erasing others completely. He could remember events from 50 years ago with perfect clarity, but couldn't remember what he'd had for breakfast. Could recite entire passages of scripture from memory, but forgot the words to songs he'd sung 1,000 times. He frowned, his face showing frustration and embarrassment. It goes ... morning light ... safe harbor. And then ... double quotes. He trailed off, his hand moving in the air like he was trying to grasp something invisible. I used to know this, soon at 100 times. The child picked up where he left off, singing the line exactly as it should be, every note in place, every word clear. Her voice was small in the basement, but it carried, bouncing off the clay walls and the low ceiling, filling the space with sound that seemed larger than should have been possible from such a small source. The preacher's face went still. He turned to one of the trunks and ran his fingers along the seam where the lid met the base, feeling for something, searching. There, stitched in thread so fine you had to hold it up to candlelight to see, were the same words, the same verse, a match. The thread was dark against the dark wood, nearly invisible, part of the decoration, but not quite, notable only if you were looking for it, only if you knew it was there. Someone had taken enormous care to hide these words in plain sight, to stitch them into a trunk that looked ordinary, that could sit in a basement for decades, without anyone noticing there was text worked into its very construction. The trunk opened with a creak, its hinges protesting, unused to movement. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that crinkled when touched, ledger pages covered in cramped handwriting, dates and names and numbers that told stories of transactions that shouldn't have happened, of people sold who should have been freed, of money that went places it shouldn't have gone. A ribbon-wrapped paper folded into a tight square, the kind of fold that made documents small enough to hide, small enough to carry in a pocket or a shoe, small enough to conceal if you needed to move quickly, and a seal impression pressed into a disc of red wax, but a different red than the one on the lock. This red was bright, clear, the color of blood or rubies. The other red was muddy, brownish, wrong. The child lifted the ribbon, not her blue ribbon, which Crow had stolen, but a different one, white silk that had yellowed slightly with age but still held together, and held it up to the candlelight. The paper inside the ribbon was covered in writing, legal language dense and formal, the kind of text that required careful reading to understand. But before anyone could read it, the child spoke. "Deceel's name is wrong," she said. Everyone leaned closer. Deceel showed a name, an office, an official stamp. But one letter was malformed, tiny mistake in the die, a flaw in the stamp that had been there so long everyone who used it had stopped noticing, but the child noticed. Her grandmother had taught her to look for such things, to see the details others missed, to understand that sometimes a single wrong letter could mean the difference between truth and lies, between freedom and bondage. Above them, footsteps sounded, heavy boots crossing the chapel floor, measured and purposeful. The scrape of a chair dragged across the boards. The creak of the door opening, bringing with it a gust of wind and the sounds of evening crickets and frogs and the rustle of grass. The preacher's face went pale. "Patrollers," he whispered. They hid in the crawl space behind the hymn books, a narrow gap between the back wall and a false panel the preacher had built years ago for exactly this purpose. Hiding places were necessary in a world where holding certain documents could get you arrested, where helping certain people could get you charged with abetting runaways, where even speaking certain truths could land you in trouble with authorities who preferred comfortable lies. The space was tight, barely wide enough for them to squeeze in single file. Sam went first, pulling himself into the darkness, feeling with his hands for obstacles or dangers, making room for others to follow. Dinah came next, still clutching the papers they'd found, holding them against her chest like treasure. Moses followed, then the preacher, moving slowly, his old body barely fitting. The child came last, her baby brother still on her hip. She had one hand covering his mouth gently, not hard enough to hurt or suffocate, just firm enough to remind him to be silent, to communicate without words that their safety depended on his quietness, and she hummed. So low it was almost just a vibration in her throat, almost silent, something you'd feel more than hear if you were standing right next to her. That the baby felt it, felt the vibration against his body, felt the rhythm that said safe, calm, wait, be still, and he obeyed. His small body relaxing, his breathing slowing to match hers, the dogs were released. The sound of their claws on the floorboards overhead was like hail on a tin roof, sharp, rapid, everywhere at once, the clicking of nails on wood mixing with snuffling and panting and the occasional whine of animals trying to sort through too many scents at once. The growling started low and rose, a sound that made your stomach drop and your legs want to run even when there was nowhere to go. It was a primal sound, a predator sound. The sound of animals who'd been bred and trained to find and corner and hold, who knew that their job was to locate hiding humans and to make sure those humans didn't escape. The crawl space smelled like old paper and mildew and fear. They were breathing each other's air, trying to control their breaths, trying not to cough or shift or make any sound that might give them away. The hymn books pressed against their backs, their covers warped from humidity, their pages musty with age. The child hummed the low note again. The same one that had bent the dogs tracking in the swamp 2 nights ago, that had confused their noses and made them circle in frustration instead of tracking with certainty. The note was so low it was almost a feeling rather than a sound, operating at a frequency that seemed to affect the dogs' ears or their brains or something in their nervous systems that made them uncertain. The growling hesitated, the pattern broke. One dog whined, high and uncertain, the confident hunting sound replaced by confusion. Another sat down with a thump that shook the floorboards, refusing to continue searching, its body language saying, "I don't know where they are, I can't find the scent, something's wrong." A third dog began to circle, sniffing the same spot over and over, unable to decide whether the scent was there or not, whether it meant anything or nothing, whether to bark alert or to move on to the next area. The handler's voice came from above, frustrated and confused. "What's wrong with them? They had the scent at the door, had it clear as day. Now they're acting like there's nothing here." Another voice answered, older, more experienced, the voice of someone who'd been doing this work for years and had seen things that defied easy explanation. "Sometimes happens in basements, airflow's strange, scents get confused. Or there's rats or cats or something else that distracts them. These are trained dogs, best trackers I've ever worked with. They don't get distracted by cats. Then maybe there's nothing here. Maybe the scent we followed stopped at the door. Maybe whoever we're looking for went around, not in." A pause. The sound of boots walking, floorboards creaking under weight, the scratch of a match being struck, the smell of tobacco as someone lit a pipe. Check the basement anyway. We're here, might as well be thorough. In the crawl space, hearts hammered, breathing stopped, muscles tensed, ready to run even though there was nowhere to run to. Ready to fight even though fighting would be futile, ready for discovery and whatever came after. The preacher climbed the ladder and met the patrollers at the top, his Bible already open in his hands, scripture on his lips before they could ask a question. It was a practiced move, a performance he'd given before, using his position and his authority and his age as shields against suspicion. He spoke about mercy and lamplight and the patience of the Lord, his voice steady and strong despite his age, despite the fear that had to be running through him, despite knowing that if they searched thoroughly, if they moved the hymn books, if they thought to check for a false panel, everyone in the crawl space would be discovered and there would be consequences he couldn't prevent. The words bought them time. The preacher kept talking, kept reading scripture, kept engaging the patrollers in theological discussion that was just interesting enough to hold attention, just boring enough to make them want to leave, just long enough for the dogs to lose interest completely. "Looking for runaways," one of the patrollers said. interrupting the preacher's recitation. Been tracking since yesterday. Trail led here. No one here but me, the preacher said, his voice calm, his face innocent. Been alone all day, praying, reading, preparing Sunday's sermon. You're welcome to look around, of course, nothing to hide. But I'm afraid you'll find nothing but dust and old books. Dogs don't lie. Dogs get confused. Trail probably went past the chapel, not into it. You know how scent works in wind, carries strange sometimes. Makes it seem like someone went one way, and they really went another. The patrollers exchanged looks. They were tired, had been tracking for 2 days, were ready to go home and collect their pay and sleep in their own beds. The preacher's calm certainty, combined with the dog's obvious confusion, made them doubt their initial conviction. We'll check the basement, one said, but his voice lacked enthusiasm. The preacher nodded graciously. Of course, I'll light your way. He led them down, lantern in hand, making a show of lighting every corner, pointing out the trunks, the quilts, the shelves of forgotten supplies. As you can see, nothing but storage, records, mostly. Old marriage certificates, baptism records, that sort of thing. Documents no one needs anymore but which I keep because it seems wrong to throw them away. History, you know. Even if it's just the history of this small congregation, it's still history. The patrollers looked around half-heartedly. One of them lifted a quilt, looked behind it, let it drop. Another opened a trunk, glanced inside, closed it. They were going through the motions, checking boxes so they could say they'd been thorough, but their hearts weren't in it. The hymn books were stacked against what looked like the back wall. No reason to think there was anything behind them. No obvious seam, or gap, or evidence of a false panel. Just books pressed against wood, gathering dust, forgotten. One of the patrollers walked toward them. His boots scuffed the clay floor. His hand reached out toward the stack of books. In the crawl space, breathing stopped completely. This was it. Discovery was seconds away. Whatever happened next, arrest, violence, flight was about to begin. The patroller's hand touched the top book, started to pull it away. Then the dogs upstairs began barking wildly, their voices rising in excitement and alarm. Something had triggered them, a real scent, maybe, or a nose outside, or some other stimulus that pulled their attention and their handler's attention away from the basement. Come on, one of the patrollers shouted down the ladder. Dogs have something outside. Let's go. The patroller at the hymn books hesitated, his hand still on the book. Now, the other voice insisted. Before we lose it, the patroller dropped the book and ran for the ladder, his boots thudding on the rungs as he climbed. Both patrollers rushed out, the dogs barking, pulling them into the darkness beyond the chapel, chasing something that was probably nothing but which gave them an excuse to leave, to stop the tedious work of searching dusty basements. When the boots finally retreated and the door slammed shut, when the dogs' barking faded into the distance and the night settled back into its own sounds, the preacher came back down the ladder. His hands were shaking worse than before, trembling so badly he had to grip the rungs with both hands to keep from falling. Sweat ran down his face despite the coolness of the basement, despite the evening air that should have been comfortable. He looked at the hymn books, at the false panel they concealed, at how close they'd come to discovery. Then he looked up at the ceiling and whispered something that might have been prayer, or thanks, or just relief that they were still breathing, still free, still able to move forward with what needed to be done. But the overseer had seen them enter. He'd been watching from the tree line, hidden in the shadows, patient and calculating. Crow knew. He'd seen the group go into the chapel with the preacher. He'd seen the patrollers arrive and search and leave. He'd seen them emerge from the basement after the patrollers were gone, seen them carrying papers and documents that they shouldn't have, that threatened everything he'd built. And he knew that whatever they'd found in that basement was dangerous to him. Knew that time was running out, that he needed to act fast before whatever evidence they discovered could be brought before people who mattered, before his carefully constructed empire of lies collapsed. The stable hand looked at the preacher and said, "We go to the courthouse, now, before he burns this." A Quaker neighbor offered a covered wagon. Her name was Ruth Pemberton, though she told them not to use her full name where anyone could hear. Names had power, names could be traced, names could be used against you and against anyone who'd helped you. Better to be just Ruth, just a neighbor, just a woman who happened to be going to town and happened to have room in her wagon for travelers. She was a plain woman with gray hair pulled tight under a bonnet, and hands roughened by farm work hands that had planted and harvested and washed and cooked and done all the tasks necessary for survival on a small farm worked mostly by herself after her husband died. She didn't ask questions, didn't need to. She could read the situation in their faces, in the way they kept looking over their shoulders, in the papers they clutched like they were made of gold instead of parchment and ink. She just helped them load the trunk and the quilts and covered them with burlap sacks that smelled like onions and old wool and the faint sweetness of apples stored too long. "Stay quiet," she said, her voice low and firm. "Don't make noise, don't shift around. Checkpoints ahead, and the patrol's been active lately. They're looking for something, though I don't know what. Best we all look like a farmer's wife going to market with her goods." They traveled at night, when the roads were supposed to be empty. Curfews ran strict. Anyone caught traveling after the bell without a pass faced arrest, or worse. The penalties had gotten harsher in recent years as the number of runaways increased, as the underground network became more sophisticated, as the authorities realized they were losing control of the system they'd built to keep people in place. Ruth knew the back roads, the routes that avoid the main patrol stations. She'd been helping people for years quietly, carefully, never making a show of it, never drawing attention. She attended her Quaker meetings, paid her taxes, kept to herself, and anyone who watched her would see nothing but a quiet woman living a quiet life. But in darkness, on routes most people didn't know, she moved people from bondage toward freedom, one wagon load at a time, but even those routes had checkpoints. Patrols had gotten smarter, had realized that the back roads were being used, had started stationing men at crossroads and river crossings and anywhere else people might try to slip through. And twice they had to stop and wait in the dark while a patrol passed, lanterns swinging, dogs panting, voices calling out questions to each other about what they'd seen and what they hadn't seen and where they should search next. The first time, the patrol passed within 20 yards. The child and her brother and the others hidden under the burlap held their breath, bodies pressed against each other, every muscle tense. Ruth sat on the wagon seat, visible and calm, her hands steady on the reins, ready with her story if the patrol stopped to question her. But they passed without stopping, without even looking closely at the wagon. Just another farmer headed somewhere, nothing worth investigating. The second time was closer. A patroller called out, "Hold there." Ruth pulled the wagon to a stop, her face showing nothing but mild curiosity. "Evening," she said pleasantly. "What's your business on the road after curfew?" "Sister's sick in town, taking her some provisions. Food, medicine, blankets. You know how it is when family needs help." The patroller walked around the wagon, his lantern held high, the light catching on the burlap, on the wagon's sides, on Ruth's plain face. "What's under the sacks?" "Onions, mostly, apples, some wool for trade. Nothing exciting, mind if I look?" Ruth's heart hammered, but her voice stayed steady. "Help yourself. But I warn you, those onions have been stored a while. They'll make your eyes water." Something fierce. The patroller lifted one corner of the burlap, got a face full of onion smell, and dropped it with a grimace. "That's foul. Told you. Still good for cooking, just smells strong. You want me to dig through and show you?" "Happy to, but you'll be crying before we're done." The patroller waved her on. "Go ahead. And get that sister of yours to come out here next time so you don't have to travel after dark. I'll tell her you said so." Ruth agreed, and clicked to the horse, moving on before he could change his